Hi everyone. Today we're going to talk about laser cutting and laser etching. Um, Specifically, I want to address being able to take our design or designs that you've created for your business card and talk about how we're going to go about processing that file. And so, you may have noticed as you learn, I have placed a template file for the business card. It's a Rhino file, and I have even placed a copy of my particular design. I'm going to pull that up. All right, this is the business card template that I've made for you all to use. So you'll notice that the left side is your template. So you're going to be drawing your design within that template, and you're going to use this as kind of a layout for how you arrange things. Now, there's a few things to talk about when discussing laser cutting. I've provided a laser cutting and etching handout that kind of goes over the process of how the laser actually goes about processing the file, both through the software and then also through the actual machine itself. And so you'll notice that I have given you an example that I'm going to use. I haven't drawn my back yet, but the front part of my card is situated in such a way where I have an overlap. Now, you don't need to worry about that overlap. That overlap, as I've stated over here, is fine because I'm going to put the card on a substrate that I'll be etching it on. So if you want a full bleed out to the edge of your card, just go ahead and overlap your design, and that'll work fine. Now, the other thing you'll notice is that I've got a whole variety of layers in here. So you'll notice I've got the front design that actually is. Well, let's start back at the top. I've got the business card outline, which you can see both the front and the back, and that's what you're seeing here and here. Same as this black outline here, and same as that. And then I've got a front design and back design, and on each of these, I have whether or not I want this object to have an infill / hatch, or if I want it to be a linear design element. Now, the blue is the linear design element, so it would be just an outline that would be etched into the card, right? Because we're not cutting through the card. The card is made of aluminum. I should actually show these on the screen. So these cards are made of aluminum that have been anodized, and that anodizing is basically it's a process we actually do at AppState in my metal studio. So basically, we can take a piece of aluminum and we can run it through an electrochemical process where it grows small microscopic pores on the surface of the metal, and those pores can accept dye, almost like Easter eggs. And so you can basically fill in the pores and you achieve a colored surface on the aluminum. So this is a process that's only done on aluminum. There is an anodizing that's done on titanium, but it's different. It's not done with dye. It's done with current. And so you're left with a very durable surface. Now, these cards are sold through Amazon, and you can get a package of these, and you can get them in different colors. I will also have black. This kind of gives you an idea of what the colors look like. You may have seen these types of colors even on mountain bike parts or motorcycle parts that are machined from aluminum, and then that anodizing actually becomes a very durable surface because aluminum is quite soft. And so we can buy a package of these cards, and then we'll be able to use a laser cutter to etch into that anodized layer. So you'll wind up having a surface that is kind of like bleached almost. And then here's an example of a card that I have that I've etched. And then I've got another example in black. This is a recent one that I just did. And then this is a former student of mine, Mike Gilligan. And this is his business card that he gave me when I was visiting with him in Milwaukee not too long ago. So again, this is what you're going to be doing. You're going to be creating this laser etched design front and back that you use as a business card. So that's a little bit about the process. Now, as we move over, and I'm going to show you here. Let me back up. So this would be the file that would be ready for export. So you would export this in millimeters because that's what the laser cutter understands in terms of its units. You can use inches as well, but typically we set ours to millimeters and keep it set to millimeters. And so you'd export this as an AI. You could also do DXF or DWG, but this would be the file that you'd export. And these layers would export with your AI export. So over here, though, is what I'm thinking about how this design looks when it's actually produced. So in this case, I've got the red layer, which is an infill or a hatch, and I have put a hatch on it. Now, you do not need to put a hatch on your particular design. Okay, you only need a line work, but you do need to tell me whether or not it's supposed to be an infill or a linear element. So in this case, I drew this up and I wanted to see what this would look like on the card, and so that's what you're seeing here. All right. Now I took it one step further and I thought, well, if my card is black, right, it's very easy for me to come in and then basically make the hatch white and black, and then I can attempt to kind of see what that finished card would look like. All right, so that's the process. So our process of working with this would be to basically take the original file right here, and we say File, Export, Selected, and we could export this as, you know, flood, business card template, and we could say underscore front. So we'll save the front and the back separately. So you'll have two files, well, three files total that you'll submit for your business card on Sunday night. You'll have the business card that's the Rhino file that has this essentially this template with your design in it, and then you'll have an AI of the front and an AI file of the back, and we'll say export. Now again, make sure when you do this that you save 1 millimeter equals 1 millimeter, and your unit should be in millimeters for things to be properly exported. And then we'll hit export. All right, and so there you can see that it saved flood business card template front AI to the desktop. All right, now the software that we're going to be using is a software called blanking out. Hang on, I'll share it with you. The software that we're using is called Lightburn. It's right here, Lightburn. And Lightburn is a separate piece of software that you import your files into. So let's go ahead and do that. So we'll say File, Import, and we'll look for our file, and we'll open. Now, if everything was done properly, you should wind up seeing something that imports your layers. You'll see the layers over here, and we can see that the scale is proper to what we're going to be cutting. Now, over here in this layers menu, you can see that you can show or turn off, just like you would with Rhino, except using the light bulbs. You can show or hide those layers. You can also choose which layers are output. So you'll notice it gets darker when we start to output. So, you know, like whichever ones are clicked, which layers. Now, sometimes you may want to actually do this in steps, but you could actually send the entire file just like this as one whole unit, and it would break up and decide what order to do that in, and run through your layers and make your various things. Now, if I want to see what this is going to look like, I can actually click this preview, and it will show me via red lines are the moves between cuts, and black is where it's going to etch. So we can see that we're going to get a cut line, which is, we're not really cutting through the metal because we can't, right, with this laser cutter. But we're going to use a cut line, so it'll just be a linear element, and for these Fs, and then for this F, it will be an infill. So that's what you're seeing here on this preview. And you can play this preview if you want to, and it'll show you where it's going to move and what order it's going to do things in. So it lets you simulate what these various layers look like. So you can see it's doing all the linear elements first. Okay, and again, we can run through this a little faster. So eventually it'll start working, and you'll notice that it starts to run line by line as it's doing the infill. Now this is what I was referring to in the handout. When you use a laser cutter, you have the option for vector or raster. And vector equates to a cut line, which is what you saw on the black. Okay, the black over these black outlines right here. But when you choose raster, it actually starts to do an etch or infill within a region. And that's why the closed regions are so important. You have to have a closed region, right, for Rhino to be able to hatch. Well, you also need a closed region for the vinyl or for the laser cutter to be able to figure out that it needs to have that area filled in. So that's why we kept stressing, make sure your regions are closed and that all your lines are joined, right? Like, it was because of the output to the laser as well. So you'll notice that when it goes to raster like this, it's actually performing this act back and forth. You can see the cutter head going back and forth like this. It's just like your inkjet printer. Whereas when we were doing the vector or the cut lines, which are the outlines, we were getting a very rapid cut, right? So the larger your design and the larger your piece, the more dark spaces you have, the longer it's going to take. So that's really good as a designer to know that, right? A lot of people that I know that work with laser cutters, or at least out making designs for laser cutters, may not be using a laser cutter to its fullest capacity when they're thinking about how long it might take to do something. If they're not thinking about like how the laser cutter works, they're not optimizing their design for that production method. And the bottom line is, eventually, time is money. And so you need to be thinking about it. And that's why what is important about this class is that I want people to come out not only knowing like what is possible with digital technology, but how it's done. And therefore, you become a better designer or artist because you understand the entire process. Regardless of whether or not you're going to have somebody else cut this eventually or not, you're able to streamline and become more proficient in terms of how you're designing based on the process you're using. So we see our preview, everything checks out. We're like, yeah, that looks good. And so we can hit OK. So now our next step is basically to send this over. And what I'm going to do, rather than we don't want to cut or etch this line, this black outline for the card, is really just for me to place some piece of material down, a piece of scrap wood, and I'm going to etch or cut that line into that wood, and then I'll know exactly where to place my business card for the next passes. And so we're going to stop here. Well, actually, I'll show you a few more things, and then we'll show you that process. So now the other thing that we're responsible for within this software is knowing how fast the laser will run and how much power the laser will have to be able to etch things. Now, depending on whether or not we're using, you'll notice here, line versus fill, right? So that's my software calls this fill. That's like scan or etch. And then line is where it's just cutting on the line, right? Which is vector or cut. You'll see that used differently in terms of the terminology on different software. So some will say cut, some will say engrave, some will say raster, some will say vector, so some will say scan. So you have to make sure you kind of understand that language. So in our case, we're using a line for the blue, and I have to set a value. And so I'm going to double click on this layer, and this is typical of most software. But basically, I've set a value of 400 millimeters per second that the head is going to be moving when it's doing the cut process. And I've given it a max and minimum power of 25 because I don't want to burn too hot, because when I'm doing that line, it could actually scorch and warp the card, and then things won't be flat and square, right, as it starts to etch things. So, and I'm also going to save that step for the last. I'm going to send the file in separate components. So that's my setting there. So if you wanted to change that, depending upon what material you were cutting, like let's say we were etching into wood, and we wanted to cut deeper, we might slow down the laser cutter so that the head moves slower, but then we might, we might wind up bumping the power up. So there's always a relationship, and I usually make, anytime I've got a new material, I usually make some test cuts and some samples that play with those values to see how deep something's going to etch in. Now on this metal, it's very, very thin, so it won't really apply, but later on we'll be talking about etching and creating relief, which we're going to be doing for our reliquary box, and that will become important there. So I'm just going to close that, and then we can say for the fill, we have, you'll notice our power is much higher because we need to burn through a lot in those areas, inside the lines. And so you'll notice we're running a lot hotter or more power on the laser, still running the same speed though, okay? So those have to be set, and those values, like I said in the handout that I gave you, is that some software or some programs, based on the wattage of your laser, will give you a specified or recommended setting for different materials, and I usually try to refer to those if I have those. A lot of the cheaper laser cutters that you may find, these kind of they're just less expensive laser cutters, and a lot of the software, and then this is one of those pieces of software. It's a cheaper piece of software. It's not as doesn't have as many options as some software that comes with, that's proprietary to a specific laser cutter, but it is still fully, pretty well featured in terms of what it can do. So with that in mind, it might look a little bit different. It might be a little harder to use and kind of navigate, but from my time in using this, I think it's actually quite versatile, especially for the price of what it costs. So again, we can play with this and do different things. So I'm going to unclick the output, and I'm going to send output just for this to be able to etch my substrate. Okay, so that's my first step. So when I've got my laser cutter hooked up and I'm ready to send this over, so I'll click send, and that'll send that file over to the laser cutter. I'm just going to walk through the steps of us using the laser cutter to etch the business cards. So our first step that we just sent over from our laser cutter was to be able to cut just the outline of that particular design. So a couple things have to happen before you use a laser cutter. One, there's what's called a water chiller. The water chiller is this device right here, and so I have to turn that on. That actually runs water through the laser tube to keep it cool, to make it last longer, all right? The other thing we have to do, which is going to get kind of noisy, is turn on the ventilation, because as we're cutting, things are burning, and we need to make sure that we're getting those fumes out. It'll also prolong the life of the laser cutter because you don't get as much residue on the lens, and because that lens, if it gets residue, it can actually start to pit or crack from the soot or residue that's then being hit by the laser. So we're going to turn on our ventilation. It's going to get noisy in here, okay? All right, so that's being vented outside. So the next step is for us to send our file. So we've got the piece of wood, the substrate, and we've placed it in the laser cutter, and I'm able to move. You'll see there's a little red dot. This is not the laser. This is just a red dot to show me the location of the cutting head. Because we have to make sure we're at 0. So you'll notice we've got an origin button right here. So I set the origin, and we know that's going to be the start point for our file. We can set that origin space, and then when the file has been sent, we can actually click on this button called box, and sometimes it's referred to as frame. And when I hit that button, the laser will basically show me where it's going to be cutting. So I might move that over just a little bit and hit box again. So we can see exactly where our file will be. All right, now the other thing that we have to do when we load a material in is we have to set the focus point. So there's a focus depth on every lens in a laser cutter. Now the lens sits right about here, and we know we want our depth to be about 52 to 56 millimeters, so that's what I'm checking there. Some lasers will have an autofocus setting where the head touches off on the material to set that particular setting. All right, so we'll close our lid. All right, and then our next step is to hit start. So there is the outline of our business cards. We can open that up. And then our next step will be to load our business card, get it positioned over where it's supposed to be. Now we're ready to cut our second file. So I'll click off of Output, and I'll send the red, which will be the infill, and I'll send it over. It's now been sent, so we're ready to run it. Alright, so our file has been loaded onto the computer, onto the laser cutter. So all we have to do is hit start. You'll notice it's burning the design into the card since we have that overlap on the file. And then we should start seeing a white line emerge as the laser cutter rasters, right? We're rastering, just like your inkjet printer. We're rastering across the surface of that anodized aluminum, burning off the color and leaving this bleached white design. The entire card is going to take a couple minutes to actually create. So we're looking at, the laser cutter has a timer on it, so we're looking right now, we've been on for 50, 51, 52 seconds. Starting to see the larger logo emerge in the center. Almost done with this layer. The laser cutter will return to its home position, its origin, when it's completed. This will be the layer that cuts just a line, so this is a vector that's set to a very low power, and we will hit send. Alright, that file's been sent. Let's go run it. I'm just going to show you before we start what that looks like with the lid open. Now, I have to be careful here. I cannot bump this card. If I bump this card, the registration will be completely off. So I have to be careful not to bump the card. Or to move it. Alright, and we're ready to send. And this is going to be much faster. So you'll notice that those lines, because we're not having to infill those, we're able to rapidly create the design for this portion. So if you were working on a job where time was of the essence, you might want to think about doing a vector cut, right? Or a vector etch versus a raster etch. It's going to be much faster, typically, depending on the design. Now right now you'll notice those lines look kind of black compared to our white lines. That's because there's a black residue from that intense burning of that region. So when I get done, I'll be able to wipe that off and it'll have a consistent white surface that matches the original, or the etch on our second file that we sent. Again, you can see the full bleed where we're cutting off into the wood, not a big deal. If you don't want the full bleed, you don't have to worry about that. We can contain the design to the card if you want to, that's fine. And the machine will go back to its home position, and your card is ready. Alright, at this point we can pick up the card. And I'll just show you, you can kind of rub that. We can take some water later on and scrub that, and some of that black, you can see that black lifting out of those areas. If you can see that or not. So that's our finished design. Now, the next step will be to flip over, create the design for the back side, and then etch it. That discoloration you see is just from the residue from the wood, so I can wash that before I run it through on the other side. Alright, here are our business cards. I've etched one of each color except for the violet and the raw aluminum. So if you have a request for a specific color, just let me know, and I'll try to run 5 of your cards. Or if you want to experiment with different colors, just let me know, shoot me an email, and I will run your design on those specific cards. You can see the black turns out a little bit less white and more gold, and so if you're thinking about black, you might consider that. And again, I am really anxious to see what you come up with for these, and I'm really stoked to be able to send these custom cards to you. So can't wait to see what you come up with. Thanks.